Colonial powers often claimed they brought civilization to Africa, but they didn't come with books or medicine. They came with guns, chains, and greed. What followed was not diplomacy or partnership, but violence, exploitation, and one of the most brutal chapters in world history. In this episode, we uncover how Africa was not only divided on paper, it was ripped apart on the ground. Through forced labor, mass killings, looting, and genocide, Europe didn't civilize Africa. It colonized it by force. The Congo Free State, Belgium's reign of terror. When King Leopold II of Belgium took control of the Congo in 1885, he didn't do it in the name of his country. He did it in his own name. The Congo was not declared a Belgian colony until 1908. For over 2 decades, it existed as the personal property of one European monarch under the deceitful name, the Congo Free State. But it was not free. It was a massive forced labor camp, ruled with terror, built on blood, and driven by profit. The lie of humanitarianism. Leopold told the world that he was in Africa to end slavery, spread Christianity, and bring civilization to the so-called Dark Continent. His mission was marketed as noble, moral, and humanitarian. He received approval from the Berlin Conference in 1885, where European powers gave him free rein over Congo, believing he would uplift the region. In reality, Leopold's empire was founded on lies, greed, and unimaginable cruelty. He quickly established a brutal regime focused on one thing: exploiting the Congo's vast rubber and ivory resources. With the invention of rubber tires and the rising demand for bicycles and automobiles in Europe and America, rubber became the new gold, and the Congo had it in abundance. Leopold's agents set up a quota system, demanding that Congolese villages harvest wild rubber under threat of death. Villagers were forced to venture deep into the forests, often barefoot, to extract sap from rubber vines. The task was so time-consuming and labor-intensive that many people starved to death trying to meet quotas. Men who failed were beaten or killed. Entire villages were burned to the ground as punishment. But the most gruesome aspect of this system was what became known as the red rubber system. Severed hands, proof of terror. In order to account for every bullet used, soldiers of the Force Publique, Leopold's private army, were required to return with a severed hand for every shot fired, as proof it wasn't wasted. This resulted in soldiers cutting off the hands of living people, especially children, to avoid using bullets and still meet quotas. Sometimes hands were cut off after executions. Other times they were taken from the still breathing as punishment and warning. These mutilations became a symbol of Leopold's terror. Hands as currency, hands as receipts, hands as reminders of submission. Photographs of piles of severed hands and mutilated children began circulating in Europe, shocking missionaries, journalists, and activists. To ensure quotas were met, women and children were taken hostage and kept in prison camps until the men returned with enough rubber. Villages that resisted were attacked. Massacres were routine, and bodies were left as warnings to others. Some missionaries documented seeing decapitated heads on poles as public displays of fear. Entire ethnic groups were decimated. Oral histories in Congo still recall villages that disappeared overnight. Those who lived were made to carry ivory, transport rubber, and build infrastructure for Leopold's enrichment, all without pay, without rest, and under the constant threat of death. The exact number of deaths is impossible to determine, but scholars and historians agree that between 8 to 10 million Congolese people died during Leopold's reign, nearly half the population. Many died from execution, starvation, exhaustion, or disease caused by forced labor and overcrowded prison camps. Entire generations were lost. The psychological scars remain embedded in Congolese society even today. This wasn't colonialism. It was one man's corporate empire of slavery, protected by international silence. The global outcry and the end of Leopold's rule. Thanks to the bravery of missionaries, whistleblowers, and journalists, most notably E.D. Morel and Roger Casement, the truth of Leopold's Congo was eventually exposed. Morel launched a campaign called the Congo Reform Association, the first major human rights movement of the 20th century. Casement's investigation provided official British documentation of the atrocities. International pressure mounted. In 1908, under global scrutiny and scandal, Leopold was forced to cede control of the Congo to the Belgian government. But by then, the damage was done. Millions were dead, cultures shattered, entire communities destroyed. And Leopold II had made himself one of the richest monarchs in European history, funded entirely by Congolese blood. The British invasion of southern Africa, diamonds, gold, and death. While Belgium was brutal in the Congo, the British Empire's colonization of southern Africa was driven by the same motive, greed. The difference? It was better organized, better marketed, and embedded in strategic warfare, backed by racial supremacy and economic conquest. Southern Africa was rich, not just in land, but in diamonds, gold, and fertile farmland. And to the British, it was too valuable to leave in the hands of Africans or the Boers. The Zulu resistance, pride, power, and betrayal. Long before British domination, southern Africa was home to powerful African kingdoms. Among them, the Zulu kingdom, founded by Shaka Zulu in the early 19th century, stood out for its military strength and unity. Shaka revolutionized warfare in the region, using short stabbing spears, tight military formations, and rapid movement tactics. The Zulus became a dominant force, feared and respected across the region. By the 1870s, the British wanted to control Zululand to link their South African colonies with those in the north. But King Cetshwayo, Shaka's successor, refused to bow to British authority. In 1879, the British launched the Anglo-Zulu War. In the Battle of Isandlwana, the Zulus achieved one of the greatest upsets in colonial history, defeating a modern British army using traditional weapons. But this victory was short-lived. The British regrouped and returned with more troops, modern artillery, and orders to crush the kingdom. By the end of the war, Zululand was annexed, King Cetshwayo was captured, and the proud Zulu nation was broken, not because they were primitive, but because they refused to be enslaved. British control and exploitation, the rise of resource imperialism. After subduing African resistance, the British moved to consolidate their control. The real reason wasn't civilization or governance, it was resources. In 1867, diamonds were discovered near Kimberley. Just a few years later, gold was found in the Witwatersrand, one of the largest gold deposits in the world. These discoveries triggered a rush of British and European investors, including Cecil Rhodes, who would become the face of British imperialism in Africa. Rhodes believed in a racist vision of British supremacy and dreamed of building a British-controlled railway from Cape to Cairo. To achieve this, Africans had to be displaced, silenced, and enslaved through laws, land grabs, and violence. Forced labor and the plundering of the land. As mining companies like De Beers, founded by Rhodes, grew in power, they began exploiting African labor on a massive scale. African men were forcibly recruited to work in mines under appalling conditions. Long hours, no safety protections, and starvation-level wages. Pass laws were introduced, forcing Africans to carry documents that restricted their movement and dictated where they could live or work. Entire communities were evicted from their land, relocated to barren reserves to make way for white settlers and mining operations. Those who resisted were beaten, arrested, or shot. The mines became a symbol of colonial capitalism, shining with wealth above ground while crushing African lives beneath it. The Second Boer War, British warfare at its cruelest. From 1899 to 1902, Britain went to war again, this time against the Boers, Dutch settlers who had established their own republics in South Africa and controlled vast mining territories. But what's often hidden in history books is how this war devastated black Africans too. The British created the first large-scale concentration camps in modern history. Over 100,000 Boers and 115,000 black Africans were imprisoned in filthy, disease-ridden camps. While over 26,000 Boer women and children died, at least 20,000 black Africans also perished, many as laborers or prisoners with no records or graves. These camps were designed not just to win the war, but to crush the spirit of any group who opposed British control, white or black. After the war, South Africa became a fully British colony, and racial segregation was codified into law, laying the groundwork for apartheid decades later. What was taken, diamonds and gold, enriched the British economy and funded the empire. African land was stolen and redistributed to white settlers. Millions of African lives were uprooted, their freedom, culture, and future sold in exchange for British imperial dominance. What the British built in southern Africa was not civilization. It was a system of resource extraction and racial domination, enforced by law, protected by guns, and justified with lies. France's colonial rule in West Africa, forced labor and cultural erasure. The French came to West Africa with banners of liberté, égalité, fraternité, liberty, equality, fraternity. But the reality was far from those ideals. Beneath the rhetoric of enlightenment, France built one of the harshest colonial systems in Africa, using forced labor, cultural assimilation, and military suppression to maintain absolute control. While claiming to civilize Africa, the French enslaved entire populations, destroyed traditional leadership, and crushed resistance with brute force. The indigenat system legalized oppression. At the heart of French colonial rule was a set of laws known as the Code de l'Indigenat, a brutal legal system that stripped Africans of basic rights. African subjects in colonies like Senegal, Mali, Guinea, Côte d'Ivoire, Niger, and Burkina Faso were not considered citizens but indigenous people, legally inferior to white French settlers. Under this code, colonial officers had the power to imprison, fine, or punish Africans without trial. Simple offenses like speaking against a French official or refusing forced labor could lead to beatings or imprisonment. Africans had no political voice, no representation, and no legal protection under colonial courts. It was a system of racial apartheid in all but name, designed to keep West Africans under total control. Forced labor and exploitation. To build railways, roads, and plantations, the French turned to forced labor, a system they called prestations. Men were rounded up from villages and sent to labor camps for months at a time without pay. They worked under inhumane conditions, constructing rail lines like the Dakar-Niger Railway, which served only French economic interests, transporting raw materials to ports for export to France. Tens of thousands died from exhaustion, malnutrition, or disease. Families were left without fathers, and entire communities were destabilized. On French-run plantations, Africans were forced to grow cash crops like peanuts and cotton for export. They could no longer grow enough food to sustain themselves, leading to hunger and economic dependency. This was not development. It was colonial slavery repackaged as public works. France's colonial strategy was not just about land and labor. It was about the complete erasure of African identity. The French promoted a policy of assimilation, which demanded that Africans abandon their languages, religions, clothing, and customs to become more French. Only a tiny elite, often educated in French schools, were granted partial rights in exchange for rejecting their heritage. African languages were banned in schools and government. Children were punished for speaking their native tongues. Traditional rulers were stripped of power and replaced by French-appointed chiefs, loyal only to the colonial administration. Indigenous religions were dismissed as superstition, while Christianity was promoted as the only civilized belief system. Africans were taught that their past was shameful, their traditions backward, and their future depended on obedience to France. This created generational identity loss that many nations are still working to recover from. Despite being denied rights, Africans were conscripted into the French army, especially during World War I and World War II. Known as the tirailleurs sénégalais, these soldiers came from all over West Africa, not just Senegal. Over 200,000 African soldiers fought for France in WWI, and thousands more in World War II. They were often sent to the front lines, poorly equipped and treated as expendable compared to European troops. After the wars, many African veterans were denied pensions, recognition, or equal treatment. Some were even massacred, such as the Thiaroye massacre in 1944, when French troops opened fire on demobilized African soldiers demanding their pay. France took African lives to fight European wars, but refused to give African soldiers the dignity of equality. Crushing resistance, the cost of independence. Whenever Africans demanded rights or resisted exploitation, France responded with military force. In Guinea, when people voted overwhelmingly for independence in 1958, France withdrew overnight, destroying hospitals, schools, and infrastructure as punishment. In Algeria, though not part of West Africa, France fought an 8-year war to prevent independence, using torture, massacres, and scorched earth tactics. Similar tactics were used in West Africa against resistance movements. Political dissenters were arrested, exiled, or assassinated. Newspapers were shut down. Activists were beaten or killed. France wanted African resources, but not African voices. Germany's genocide in Namibia, the first genocide of the 20th century. Before the Holocaust shocked the world, Germany had already committed genocide in Africa, one that is still unknown to many outside the continent. Between 1904 and 1908, in what is now Namibia, the German Empire carried out the systematic extermination of the Herero and Nama peoples. This was not collateral damage from war, it was a calculated policy of ethnic cleansing. The roots of rebellion. Germany colonized southwest Africa, now Namibia, in the late 19th century. Like other European powers, they seized land, imposed taxes, and forced Africans into brutal labor conditions on farms and railroads. By the early 1900s, Herero lands had been taken by German settlers. Cattle, the primary source of livelihood, were stolen. Herero men and women were abused and enslaved on their own land. When the Herero people could no longer tolerate the oppression, they rebelled in 1904, attacking German outposts. Instead of responding with military engagement alone, Germany chose annihilation. General Lothar von Trotha's extermination order. The German commander, General Lothar von Trotha, issued a chilling proclamation. The Herero people must leave the land. If they do not do this, I will force them with the Grutrohr cannon. Any Herero found within the German border, with or without a gun or cattle, will be shot. This was a public declaration of genocide. German forces drove the Herero into the Kalahari Desert, sealing off waterholes and preventing return. Thousands died of dehydration, starvation, and heat exhaustion. Survivors who returned were captured, beaten, and imprisoned. By the end of the campaign, over 80% of the Herero population was dead, reduced from 80,000 to less than 15,000. Shortly after, the Nama people, another ethnic group, also resisted German control and faced the same fate. Over 10,000 Nama were killed, and many others were imprisoned or exiled. Entire villages were razed. Families were separated and sold into forced labor. Like the Herero, the Nama were subjected to slavery, rape, and cultural destruction. Survivors of the genocide were not freed. They were sent to some of the first concentration camps of the 20th century, such as Shark Island. At Shark Island, prisoners lived in open-air cages without food, medical care, or sanitation. Thousands died of exposure, disease, and starvation. Women were raped by German soldiers, and children were used for medical experimentation. Skulls and body parts of Herero and Nama victims were shipped to Germany to support scientific racism, used in universities to justify Aryan superiority. This ideology would later resurface during the rise of Nazi Germany. Germany's silence and late acknowledgement. For over a century, the German government refused to recognize these atrocities as genocide. It was only in 2021 that Germany officially acknowledged the genocide and offered financial support, but stopped short of full reparations or returning looted land and artifacts. To this day, many descendants of the victims live in poverty, while German settlers still occupy their ancestral lands. This genocide was the blueprint for future atrocities and a reminder that colonization wasn't just theft. It was murder. The impact. What Africa lost due to colonization. Colonization didn't just redraw maps or create new countries. It ripped apart the fabric of African civilizations. The impact is still visible today in conflicts, poverty, and broken systems across the continent. Africa was once home to powerful kingdoms and empires, from Mali and Songhai to Congo, Ethiopia, Great Zimbabwe, and the Zulu. Colonization dismantled these sovereign states. Kings and chiefs were exiled, killed, or turned into powerless figureheads. Traditional governance systems were replaced with European models, imposed with no understanding of local customs. Entire communities were made subjects of foreign empires, without their consent or voice. Africa's vast natural wealth, gold, diamonds, rubber, oil, copper, ivory, was ruthlessly extracted and shipped to Europe. The British took gold and diamonds from South Africa. The French drained West Africa of its groundnuts and cotton. The Belgians looted rubber and ivory from the Congo. The Germans and Portuguese exploited African mines, forests, and rivers, leaving the land exhausted and polluted. By the end of colonization, trillions of dollars worth of resources had been stolen, with little to no reinvestment in African societies. Destroyed cultures and erased histories. European colonizers saw African traditions as savage and inferior. Indigenous religions were banned. Shrines and sacred places were destroyed. Native languages were suppressed. Colonial languages became official, erasing generations of oral literature and wisdom. African customs, dress, family structures, rituals were mocked, outlawed, and replaced with European norms. Generations of Africans were taught to be ashamed of their identity, creating cultural disconnection that still haunts the continent today. Divided nations and engineered conflicts. Colonial borders were drawn without regard for ethnic, tribal, or linguistic groups. Rivals were forced into the same country, fueling ethnic conflict. Allied groups were separated by artificial borders, weakening traditional alliances. Some were privileged by colonial powers, while others were excluded, creating cycles of mistrust and violence. Many of Africa's civil wars, genocides, and separatist movements today can be traced back to the colonial border map. Millions of deaths and centuries of trauma. The human cost of colonization is incalculable. Tens of millions of Africans were killed through forced labor, war, genocide, famine, and disease. Millions more were enslaved, displaced, and separated from their families. Trauma was passed down across generations, in poverty, broken institutions, and unresolved grief. Even after independence, neocolonialism, debt traps, and foreign control continue to hold Africa back. Colonization didn't end with flags coming down. Its consequences still shape Africa today. Conclusion: the enduring legacy of colonial brutality in Africa. The colonization of Africa was not a mission of civilization, but a calculated endeavor of exploitation and domination. European powers, driven by greed and a sense of superiority, dismantled thriving African societies, extracting immense wealth while inflicting profound human suffering. Systematic exploitation and cultural suppression. Colonial regimes restructured African economies to serve European interests, leading to the collapse of indigenous industries and creating a dependency on imported goods. Traditional cultural practices were suppressed and local governance structures were dismantled, causing irreversible transformations in African societies. Artificial borders and enduring conflicts. The arbitrary borders drawn by colonial powers, often disregarding existing ethnic and cultural divisions, have left a legacy of political and social challenges. These imposed boundaries have been a source of ongoing conflicts and instability in many African nations. A call for acknowledgement and reparations. The consequences of colonialism continue to affect Africa's development. There is a growing movement among African leaders and communities advocating for reparations and the return of cultural artifacts taken during the colonial era. This call seeks not only financial compensation, but also a formal acknowledgement of historical injustices and policy reforms to address ongoing disparities. Moving forward, recognition and reconciliation. Understanding this history is crucial for fostering genuine partnerships between Africa and the global community. Recognizing the enduring impacts of colonialism is a vital step toward meaningful reconciliation and the promotion of equitable development. Reflecting on the past to shape the future. The atrocities committed during Africa's colonization serve as a stark reminder of the depths of human cruelty when driven by unchecked power and greed. By confronting this past, we can work toward a future that honors the resilience of African societies and ensures that such exploitation is never repeated. If this story moved you, if it opened your eyes to a truth rarely told, don't let it end here. Like, share, and subscribe to help us uncover more forgotten histories. Let the world know what really happened. Let their voices be heard. This is not just Africa's story, it's the world's story, and it deserves to be remembered.